Our guest this week on Veterans Chronicles is Dillon Behr, a U.S. Army Green Beret who served in both Iraq and Afghanistan. He received a Silver Star for his service as a result of a very intense firefight in Afghanistan that also very nearly took his life. And Dillon, welcome. It's great to have you with us. It's an honor to have you share your story with us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, let's start at the very beginning. Where were you born and raised?
I was born and raised in Rock Island, Illinois, about 3 hours west of Chicago on the Illinois-Iowa border.
Quad Cities.
Yeah, the Quad Cities. And raised there until college and then the Army, pretty much. So.
When and why did you join the service?
Joined the Army shortly after 9/11, partially because of that and partially because I was a really terrible college student. I spent about 4 years in college, 3 different schools, jumping around, not doing well, and decided I need to get a little bit of discipline in my life finally. And Army was a logical choice. They happened to have a great program for me to go straight into Special Forces right out of, if I qualified for everything and made it through all of the hurdles, I could go straight off the street into Army Special Forces.
So that was an interest of yours right off the bat?
I wouldn't say it was an interest right off the bat, but it was something that was presented to me after I had taken some tests, the Army entry exam, and qualified at a high level, and I was identified as a good candidate for the program. I had no idea that it existed prior to me walking into the recruiter's office.
Hopefully this is not state secrets, but what are they looking for in Special Forces?
Looking for this qualification, you had to be able to physically pass the Army Physical Fitness exam prior to joining the military, which most people don't have to pass this until they finish basic training. For this program, you had to pass it before you even join the Army. So you already had to be in a decent shape. Mm-hmm. And then they were looking for a general technical score on the ASVAB of 110 or higher, which basically qualifies you for any job in the military.
Physical and mental.
A little bit of both, yeah. And then they're just looking for, I don't know why they picked me, but they're looking for people that kind of generally have their things in order and are going to be successful in the program.
Is there a lot of military experience in your family? Your dad?
A little bit, yeah. So both of my grandfathers were in the military. One was in the Army, one was a Marine. My dad was a Navy diver. Just prior to just after Vietnam and towards the end of it, and I'm the only person from my generation that was in the military. So there was definitely a little bit of lineage there. Not super strong, and nobody pushed me towards it at all, but it was definitely there.
Where did you go for your training?
I went initially to Fort Benning, Georgia, for small unit basic training and infantry training, and then airborne school, and then was transferred to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, where I did a special operations preparation course and selection, and all through the Army Special Forces candidate school. And then I actually stayed there. I got stationed after the Green Beret School at Fort Bragg.
What was the toughest part of the training, whether in the beginning or as you got into Special Forces?
For me, the toughest part of the training was the running. I was a really terrible runner. Seriously, I think the toughest part of it is really just not quitting. And I think that's what gets most people, is the mental toughness. You have an opportunity to stop training at any time that you want. And that's what gets most of the people injuries and just quitting, basically. It's a mental thing, and I was able to get through that by basically deciding that I didn't want to be down the street at the 82nd or any other infantry unit. Not that there's anything wrong with them, but I wanted to be with the Special Forces, and if I gave up, there was no chance of that happening.
Did you think about it a few times?
Not really. I actually saw some other people quit early on, and that actually drove me more to not want to do it. I don't think it ever occurred to me that, that was an option for me. That seemed more like failure than another option.
And that will play well into the story that we're going to talk about a little bit later, that refusal to give up. What was it like to get that Green Beret?
It was about 3 years in the making, so it was pretty, it was almost like graduating from college, only much more rigorous mentally and physically, I think. It's one of the great accomplishments of my life so far, I think. Hopefully other things will surpass that, but at that time it was definitely one of the greatest things that I've done personally as far as accomplishment.
And when did you finish that?
That was 2005 is when I actually graduated from the course in 2004 and then still had to go through language school and survival, escape, resistance, and evasion, or SEER, after that. So I didn't get out of the entire course until 2005.
And then it was pretty quick after that you're deployed to Iraq, correct?
Pretty much immediately. I showed up at my team and my company at Fort Bragg, and they were already deployed to Iraq. And so it took me a couple weeks to get all of my processing done and get all my equipment, and I met my team downrange.
What unit were you attached to?
3rd Special Forces Group. I was on ODA 3336. When I first joined, it was 396, and then they changed the naming convention of all the teams. It became 3336.
So 2005, things are not great in Iraq. You're kind of starting to see the sectarian violence and the insurrection from all the different factions inside Iraq. What were your primary duties during that deployment?
Yeah, definitely a lot of turmoil in Iraq at that time. Our team was based in Tal Afar, which is up in the northwest, west of Mosul.
Okay.
Which, if you pay attention to the news lately, you've seen
right.
Mosul as the haven of ISIS and stuff like that. So Tal Afar is not too far away from there. And when I showed up on base, onto the team, they basically told me, get ready, tomorrow we're going to take over the city. It had been overtaken by insurgents at the time. And we had a mission along with the 5th Infantry Division at that time to go in and basically take back the city from terrorist control. And so that was my second day in Iraq, was going in and taking the city. It certainly was not as intense as what I know of Fallujah, but that's what we were prepared to go into, is a Fallujah-style battle.
What's your mental state going into your first real combat?
I was scared. I really didn't know what to suspect. I'd been in the military for 3 years now, and I'd basically been in training for the entire time. I've done a little bit of role-playing in some combat situations and stuff, a lot of it actually, but nothing really prepares you for the fact, knowing that real-life bullets could be flying at you. And also I'm on a new team with people that I just met the day before, and we're going into a combat, a real live combat situation. And I'm not the only person that this story is not unique to me, for sure. But it was definitely, there's a lot going through my mind at that time. All the things that I didn't know and things that could go wrong. And
was there any confusion as a result of the fact that you hadn't worked together before, or is the training in Special Forces so consistent that everything kind of falls into place?
There's definitely confusion. I mean, again, I've only been in training, so I hadn't worked in real life with any of these people. I didn't know the unit SOPs. I didn't know how these guys acted in any situation, really. And so it was, I was the new guy on the team, even though I was, an E5 at the time. I'm still basically a private, essentially, in the eyes of the rest of the guys on my team. And they treated me like that. And made sure that I knew what I was doing. And so there's a great deal of leadership, but there's also a lot of figure it out and make things happen. So, within a couple days, I was driving the vehicles. I didn't get out and do as much patrolling as, some of the guys that had been around for a while. I was driving the vehicles and making sure I'm pulling security and all that stuff.
You mentioned that you were prepared for the intensity of Fallujah as best as you could understand what happened in Fallujah, and it ultimately didn't turn out that way. So how did it turn out?
Yeah, so one of the things that I think they learned in Fallujah is, and I think because there were some issues with civilian casualties and stuff like that, so they actually made announcements, hey, we're coming into the city, and you can debate whether or not that's a great tactic for, rooting out insurgents, but there were announcements made, we're coming in to take over the city. If you're, still here after such date, you'll be considered an enemy combatant. So with that, a lot of people, not only civilians, but also some of the potential insurgents, just decided to leave town and not fight us and then come back another day. So we went in and we definitely did have some firefights, from the more extreme or extreme fighters that wanted to stay in town. But we had so much fire superiority that we generally didn't feel too threatened by a lot of it.
Our guest in studio today is Dillon Behr. He is a veteran of the U.S. Army, a Green Beret, a veteran of both Iraq and Afghanistan, and a recipient of the Silver Star. We were talking about your first combat experience. Fortunately, a lot of the insurgents hightailed it out of there, and ultimately there were a few firefights, but it was a successful mission. What did that do for your confidence, the confidence of your unit, about the rest of the work that lay ahead of you on that deployment?
Yeah, so this was about a 3 or 4 day operation. We had left the fire base and pretty much stayed down in the town of Talafar for that whole time. So it was really a lot of action for my first week, basically, in country. Trial by fire, and kind of thrown in the deep end, so to speak. So I learned a lot, and coming back from that, there was a lot of camaraderie built just in a few days of being out there on the mission. And so I was able to come back and already start to feel part of the team. And then on top of that, start to feel, I made it through my first combat mission.
Right.
So, and I didn't die. So there was, a little bit of success. I felt success. And
talk about that camaraderie. Obviously, it's critical because your units usually on missions aren't that big, so you're really relying on each person,
right?
So much. So that might be a little bit different than other units that aren't special forces. So talk about that if you can.
So I think in pretty much all units, especially in the military, there is a great bit of camaraderie, and you hear stories about this all the time. But I think in the special forces, it's forged even a little bit deeper. You're on a 12-man team. You spend a lot of time with just those 12 guys. And then on top of that, you're going through some of the most intense situations that anybody has ever experienced. And so those sorts of the bonds forged under battle are sometimes greater than, I don't know what you compare it to, maybe a fraternity or something like that. It's definitely something that you can't identify with others on that. And you see that with veterans a lot. They'll only talk to other veterans about their stories because they feel that person can kind of understand it. I think it's even more so in the special forces and some of these elite fighting units.
What else stands out to you from your time in Iraq? Where did you go after that? What other areas did you serve in?
So we stayed in that general area for Iraq, spent the mission, the 6 months that I was there, training up some Iraqi soldiers up in the Talafar area so that they could kind of take over the area. And then...
What was that like? Because there are some stories ranging from competent to completely clueless. What was your experience?
We had some special operations guys that were top-notch. They would stand up to any special forces unit in most countries. And then we also had some guys that you may have seen in a video on YouTube doing jumping jacks. So there's a little bit of a discrepancy in the quality of soldiers, but you get that even in fully developed countries. Mm-hmm. So yeah, we saw the gamut of it. Ours were middle of the road, perhaps, but we were able to be successful in training them to be a self-sustaining force.
Last question on Iraq. Obviously, since you left, a lot has happened there, and the northwest to northeast parts of Iraq came under ISIS control, Anbar province, a lot of it. What was it like to see that?
Well, I'm not going to get political about
Sure.
it at all, but it is, it was disheartening kind of to see how much effort and how many lives have been lost over there, to see it just very easily go into ISIS control. It's a kick in the pants, kind of, and I can understand why a lot of people have real issues with that, because a lot of it is based on decision making and not just, a power vacuum necessarily. But it's tough to watch, but you also know that you were there for each other and there for hopefully the right reasons, and it is what it is. You just deal with it,
Between Iraq and the Afghan deployment, where we'll spend the bulk of our interview, there was a first deployment to Afghanistan. What was the mission there?
Yeah, the mission there was to train a Afghan police unit. So we went in there and we had about 20 police officers in Gardez, on the eastern side of Afghanistan. And we basically just trained them for 7 months, and to make them be able to police their own territory. There was a little bit of combat during that one, but nothing super, real significant like my second deployment to Afghanistan.
Dillon, it was your second deployment to Afghanistan that really changed your life and provided the most indelible moments of your time in service to our country. Just for a moment before we get to that, when you served in Afghanistan the first time and on the second tour there, what did you see as the biggest differences between Iraq and Afghanistan? Obviously, the topography is quite different, but what else?
Sure. The biggest difference to me between Iraq and Afghanistan is the people. Obviously, there's a cultural difference and a development difference. Iraq is much more developed than Afghanistan is as a whole. Certainly, there are some pockets of Afghanistan that are well developed, but generally, it's a third world country. Iraq is well developed, but not fully, and I don't think that they appreciated the American presence there, if I could say. I don't think very highly of my time in Iraq or of the Iraqi people in general that I interacted with. Whereas Afghanistan, maybe it's because I spent more time there, or maybe it's because the people are different, but I felt like I could get behind the Afghanistan mission a little bit more, and some of the people anyway seemed to be happy that the Americans were there and think that we were there to help them. It was a much more cooperative effort.
Let's talk about April 6th, 2008. What was the mission?
The mission was, well, first off, let me back up a little bit. During this entire deployment, our team had been given a huge mission as far as Special Forces missions go, to train the very first Kandak, which is basically a battalion of Afghan commandos. So Afghanistan had never had a special operations force prior, and our 12-man ODA was to stand up the first battalion of Afghan commandos. This is 700 guys. So it was a huge deal, and we had a lot of people looking at our missions in general, not just this specific one, but as the whole mission. And so every month we took these guys from basically infantry unit to a special operations unit, and every month the missions would get a little bit more intense, a little higher level targets, go from essentially a training mission to a full-blown operation, which on April 6, 2008 was Operation Commando Raf, the largest and most high-profile mission that the Afghan commandos had ever been on. And we were there to advise and lead through combat these guys to take out a high-level HIG commander by the name of Haji Ghafoor.
To get to this commander was extremely challenging. He's basically on the top of a mountain, and you had to climb it.
Right. So not only did we have to climb the mountain, but we had to fly to the mountain. We were based out of Jalalabad, and this valley, Shuk Valley, Kendall Village, was a long helicopter flight from Jalalabad deep in the mountains of Nuristan.
And so once you were dropped there, how did you attack the mountain?
So once we were dropped, first thing we had to do is get across the river that they dropped us on the wrong side of. Because we had a large contingent of Afghan commandos that were still somewhat inexperienced, the leadership decided that we should not fast rope onto the mountain and into the houses, but instead we would land in the valley and work through the valley and then up the mountain to the target. There was a lot of pushback from leadership on our team and our team leaders to not do the mission that way, but ultimately it was decided that that's how it was going to be done. And so the first thing that we had to do was cross this river, which anybody that's been in the military knows that you don't want to get wet if you can help it. So that was the first kick in the pants, so to speak, was to have to get wet immediately after touching on the ground. And then we had to move towards the mountain and then start basically scaling up this mountain, which, if you're familiar with Afghan towns built into mountains, it was very steep and sort of a tiered approach. They build basically all of their agriculture into the side of the mountain in little levels, but they're 6, 8, 12 feet ledges. And we were basically climbing up one of these, and it was essentially mountain climbing in some places. We were taking our packs off and handing to the person above us or below us. Like, not the ideal situation if you have to get into a firefight.
How far up the mountain were you when the fighting began?
I was about halfway up. I was with the command element, so the team leader. I was the communications guy on the team, so I had the radio that day. We also had our lead translator and our combat cameraman and our JTAC, Joint Tactical Air Controller. So we were in about the middle of the pack. We had a bunch of Afghans and part of our team up ahead of us, and then some in blocking positions and behind us.
So obviously they've got the advantage being on the high ground. Did you have any cover whatsoever when this started?
Yeah, so the enemy combatants not only had the high ground, but they had us almost surrounded, and we were in sort of a bowl, and they had dug in fighting positions. No Americans, no Westerners had ever been to this village. I don't even believe that the Russians were there when they were in Afghanistan. So we really had little idea what we were really going into. We knew the terrain was going to be bad. We didn't know it was going to be that bad, but we didn't know what we were walking into as far as, how many enemy combatants and what the situation would be like. And we were completely exposed on the mountainside. There was almost no cover from where the enemy could just shoot at us. A few rock outcroppings here and there, maybe a felled tree, but generally you're just out in the open.
So how did you protect yourself, and how did you try to fire back?
So the way that the battle started, one of our teammates came across the radio and said, "Hey, I see a couple guys with an RPG," and our team sergeant gave the instruction over the radio to take them out. And we knew once one bullet goes, the firefights can start. So we sort of prepared a little bit, but again, there was nowhere really to hide. And we didn't know where all of the insurgents were. We heard over the radio from aircraft in the area that there were a bunch of combatants gathering on rooftops and spreading around to different buildings and everything. But we didn't know where they were. We couldn't really see them from our position. So once the gunfire started, bullets immediately started impacting around the command element where I was. And the only thing that we could do at the time was there was a small rock outcropping to our left as we're climbing up the mountain. And we all quickly jumped, about 4 or 5 of us jumped underneath this rock outcropping. And it immediately became clear that that was not a safe place. Bullets were impacting right around my feet. And our Afghan interpreter was shot in the neck right next to me. So I made a quick decision that I needed to get out of there. dropped to a knee, started firing in the area where I believe the fire to be coming from so that I could suppress it and move to a better covered position. And as I got up to move from that position towards a felled tree, I was hit in the hip with a gunshot through my femoral head, the ball and socket of my pelvis.
And from what I've read, the pain was instant and excruciating.
Yeah, I always compare it to, not that I've been hit by a car, but kind of like being hit by a car and electrocuted at the same time.
Describe the electrocution part of that.
Yeah, so it was more like a reverberation because the bullet had hit my bone, and in a very solid part of it, like a reverberation through my entire body as I fell to the ground. That was, that's the best way that I can describe it.
At that point, are you still thinking about the mission? Are you thinking about your being exposed? Are you thinking about dealing with the pain? What's going through your mind at this point?
Yeah, at that point, it's hard to think about anything, about the mission anymore at that point. I think, some guy later on, I was shot through the bicep, and that was a minor injury that I could have fought through. But being hit in basically the ball and socket of my hip, there's nothing else to think about. My initial thought was that this was a life-threatening injury. I had been shot exactly where the femoral artery is, and that I was going to bleed out in a minute. Because we've seen videos of that. We all train for what to do in that situation, but it seemed like the worst-case scenario at that point.
So what happened next? So
after that, some of my teammates started making their way towards me. One of the guys on my team, Luis Morales, finally made it to my position and started rendering aid. He was trying to put pressure on my hip, putting some rags in there and using his knee to keep pressure on it. And while he was doing that, he was actually shot while he was giving aid to me. So I had my hand up like so, so that he could get in here, and was leaning against the felled tree, and a bullet came through my bicep and went straight into Luis's leg. And so now we have two guys, plus our interpreter, who at this point was dead, two Americans in very close proximity, critically injured. And then shortly after that, Luis was hit by a second bullet that shattered his ankle. So he's effectively out of the mission as well.
With them having, again, the high ground, you don't have any place to protect yourselves. The rest of your team's focusing on you guys and trying to get you out of there, I'm guessing, at this point.
I think at this point, the gunfire was still so strong that we hadn't even thought about getting out of there yet. We're still trying to take control of this battle. One of the things that we always try to do in any situation, and this is why we have the gun trucks and air fire, is we want to take over the fire superiority, right? We want to be throwing more bullets downrange than they are at us to keep their heads down so that we can move to a better position. We were unable to gain fire superiority for a long time in this battle.
And the battle went on for about 6 hours? Is that correct?
The battle went on for about 6 hours. It didn't take us that long to get fire superiority, but it was a long time before we were able to feel like we had a little bit of control over the battlefield.
And despite all the disadvantages, other than your interpreter, the rest of your unit survives, and there's about 150 of them, of the enemy, that were killed?
Yeah, it depends on which book you read or who you ask, but I think the estimates are there were about 200 of them, and maybe 150 of them were killed. We had 4 guys on our team, 4 Americans, that were critically injured. One guy, his leg was effectively amputated just below the knee, and another guy, our team sergeant, was shot through the arm and had a lot of nerve damage. We also had several other Purple Hearts on the team for relatively minor injuries.
Absolutely amazing. As the 6 hours played out, what were you doing?
Trying to live.
Because you thought at one point this was it.
Myself and Luis had been moved a little bit around the corner there to a relatively safer position. And from there, our medic, Ron Schur, was able to get down to us and start giving us aid. Ron administered morphine and some other life-saving aid to us. And in the course of, I don't know, a half hour, an hour of just stabilizing, the team sergeant was shot through the arm and John Walding was shot through the leg, and we were all about 10 feet away from each other. So where I had initially been shot, it was just a death trap. Everybody that was coming in there was getting shot, and it was almost impossible to get out of there. So we ended up having to go down the back side of the mountain. That there was not a trail. It was, okay, we're going to drop you down this cliff, and hopefully it doesn't hurt anything worse.
How far are we talking about here?
20, 30-foot they We would have one guy go down below, and one guy would literally, and I have no clothes on at this point, pretty much. They put my body armor back on, and my leg is, the skin and muscle is all still there, but I have no bone in my hip, and we didn't know, that it very easily could have severed an artery or something. But they would hold me down by the shoulder straps of my Kevlar and then drop me the rest of the way.
And you're just bouncing off the mountain?
Yeah, pretty much. It was excruciating.
Do you remember that?
Oh, yeah. That was as painful as getting shot. Even though I already had the morphine running through me, that kind of brought it all back. It was pretty bad. We're also moving, and we were getting out of there, so.
There was a purpose to it all.
Yeah.
Fortunately. Explain what happened once they finally got you down to the base.
So once I got down there, then they started calling in the helicopters. And it took a couple tries for the helicopters to get in. The first time, I thought that they were coming in to pick me up. My medic had told me that I was the first one out of there. And the helicopter got very close to touching down and took off. Turned out that the helicopter was being shot at by the guys that were still out there fighting us, and rounds were getting pretty close to the pilot. I think he may have even gotten hit. So he had to get out of there quick, and then a few minutes later, another helicopter was able to come in, but then they picked up a couple of my teammates and took off without me, and I was like, what the heck, what's going on? I thought I was the first one out of here. Turns out one of the other guys, I had stabilized a little bit, and he was progressing a little bit worse. So I had to wait for the third helicopter to come in, and finally got on the bird, and immediately they started working on me, and then we took off, and I was able to kind of lean back and look over my shoulder and see the valley below me. And just like any mountain range from the bird's eye view, it's beautiful. But at the same time, I knew that this was hell on earth that I had just come through, and that my buddies were still down there fighting this battle. And there was nothing I could do about it.
Whatever happened to the terrorist leader?
He got away that time, and I honestly don't know what his status is right now. But there were several follow-on operations to rectify that issue.
Then I assume you were evacuated either to Germany or back to the States?
Yeah, so initially I went back to Bagram.
Okay.
And they did some initial triage and stabilization. And then I was evacuated to Landstuhl, Germany, and then back to Walter Reed, along with the 3 other critically injured teammates.
And what was required to heal you there?
I spent 2 months in the hospital, and part of the problem was that I had my intestines ruptured. Rock had been blasted off of the mountain and landed on my stomach and perforated my intestines. So that's what kept me in the hospital the longest. And then I had an external fixator on my hip for about 2 months. Then I was released from the hospital, and I had to stay on base primarily in a wheelchair and had a little walker, but I had no hip. I was just kind of hanging out with a dangling leg. I was a little worried that I might not ever be able to walk again, but in September 2008, I had my hip replaced. So now I have a prosthetic hip, and was able to start doing physical therapy and rehab right after that. And, it took a little while to get going, but once I could walk without any assistive devices, just kind of went for it, and I've made as close to a full recovery as I think I can. It hasn't held me back in hardly any ways, and I've been very, very fortunate.
How are your buddies doing?
Most of the buddies are doing really well. Most of the guys have gotten out of the military. all doing great things now. The medic that saved my life, he is a Secret Service agent. Other guys are running their own businesses, amputees doing triathlons, and everybody's raising families. So life goes on.
So fully functioning veterans. Just a little bit of time left. I don't know if this was a result of your own rehab, but I know you started a nonprofit gym at Walter Reed. Explain how that idea came about.
Yeah, I had started doing CrossFit a little bit before I got injured. And I was fortunate to have a physical therapist that did CrossFit. And so we would start going over to the gym and just start doing workouts. So when I got out of the military and moved to Arlington, I linked up with my coach at my local gym, and we decided to go to Walter Reed and just start offering classes. And it eventually turned into a nonprofit, and we built a gym at Walter Reed called CrossFit Walter Reed. And we used it to specifically help wounded service members who were recovering at Walter Reed find another outlet for their physical therapy and recovery.
And what's the response been?
Response was great. We actually shut it down about a year ago as the war is kind of dwindling. Mm-hmm. It served its purpose. Another amputee took the equipment and started a gym elsewhere to do sort of the same mission. But personally, I think that's one of the coolest things that I've done with my life as far as serving others. So I'm really proud of that and what it evolved into and the other things that it inspired.
You should be. It's a great idea, and I'm sure there are a lot of people that benefited from that. After this incredible story and your amazing service to our country, you're awarded the Silver Star, as well as 9 other members of your unit. What did that mean to you?
I'm honored to receive the Silver Star, of course, but the other guys on the ODA were the heroes that day.
What are you most proud of about your service?
Honestly, I think it's more about what I did after with Walter Reed. I think being able to go through all of that and come out the other side and then be able to transfer some of that knowledge and experience. Being injured on that day gave me a different sense of how important relationships are, things that I kind of took for granted before. So I think that's what's made me most proud is, yes, my service was pretty cool, but really the person that it's made me since is something to be proud of.
It's an amazing story. We thank you for your time today, Dillon, and thank you for your service to our country and to the other veterans who have needed the help that you needed at one time.
Thank you. I appreciate it. It's been an honor to be here. Thanks.
Thank you, sir. Dillon Behr is a veteran of the U.S. Army, a Green Beret, recipient of the Silver Star, veteran of Iraq and Afghanistan. I'm Greg Columbus. This was Veterans Chronicles.